So I start now the second small section here about mainstream economics. This is just, to get some common background. Just as a preliminary note, it is not entirely clear today what belongs to mainstream economics and what not. This used to be clear 20 years ago or 25 years ago, but it's not completely clear now, especially regarding behavioral economics, whether that's part of the mainstream or not. I looked at several university institutes in Germany and also in Switzerland and tried to find out whether they have professorships for behavioral economics. And there are quite a few where there is none, or they have 15 full professors and one assistant professor for behavioral economics. It's even different. Well, I come back to it when I talk about behavioral economics. Now, the main schematic division in mainstream economics, all of you know that, is of course normative economics, positive economics, and positive economics consisting of micro, macro, and econometrics. These are the main divisions there. Usually people speak about three, but it's really four: normative, micro, macro, and econometrics. And the most important contrast is between different fields here is namely the contrast between positive and normative economics. What is the difference here, and what is the mutual, possibly, relationships between them? And also the question then, I mentioned it already a couple of times, macroeconomics versus microeconomics. And this is the sections here 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, and 2.4, in which I talk about them. And then about these other things like behavioral economics, that comes later than as modern developments in economics, I think in the chapter section 7 or whatever it was, 7 and 8, right? So this is what I'm going to talk about. And we first talk about normative economics. As I said, I was surprised in one of the last classes that not all students were really fully informed about normative economics, what it was all about, and how it related to positive economics. And that's a sort of question, where philosophers may look upon a science and say, look, you have different divisions here, different compartments of that science. How do they relate to each other? And that may be of lesser interest to the practitioners. But if you want to understand how the whole enterprise works, then you say that is something that could be important or could be interesting. So, what is normative economics? Well, very roughly speaking, normative economics concerns the articulation of goals, norms, and values for the economy. The articulation meaning not only the pronunciation, but also the working out, what does it mean in detail. I'll come back to that. Then it concerns the evaluation of economic actions with respect to certain goals. So you want to know of a certain political action, for instance, with the economic consequences, whether that was supporting a certain goal you have formulated or politicians have formulated or not. So it's this evaluative aspects, norms and values, therefore the name normative economics. Now the evaluation in mainstream economics is mostly in terms of welfare. This is the fundamental term, as you all know, therefore one speaks of welfare economics also. But this is not the only possible goal, it's just the most established goal in standard economics. There are other goals that one could pursue by economic or political actions: equality, all sorts of equality, especially, of course, economic equality, freedom, justice, happiness, possible other goals by which, or norms by which you could evaluate political actions with economic consequences. Normative economics today is often called welfare economics, and that, so to speak, presupposes then that the main value, source of value, is the idea of welfare. That economics, macroeconomics, and then political actions have to do with increase of welfare, whatever that means exactly. There is, of course, in all of normative economics, a question in the background that must be somehow be treated: what is good for human beings? What sort of sense does a human life possibly make to these humans? So there are fundamental questions about human happiness, sense of human life, are in the background of normative economics, always. And you cannot get rid of that. And these questions are, of course, well, philosophical questions, at least they are very hard to answer. And if you want to have answers from which you say, I can argue for this answer, then the question is, what will be the source of arguments, right? What is the source where you say, oh, I get my argument that welfare is more important than equality or happiness is more important than this and that? What are the sources for these sort of arguments? And there you are just in the middle of philosophy, right? With all that, what I said in the beginning, everything's controversial in philosophy. So you have that problem, but that problem is in the background of normative economics because it's always the question, what is good? And therefore, you make some decisions and later you may say, well, these are not the right decisions. So these questions belong to moral philosophy, and they have received very different answers in different cultures, subcultures, and different historical times. So in different historical times, of course, just survival and having the most substantial things for survival may be the fundamental economic question. And that may change, of course, in societies like, say, Switzerland, in which this is not the main problem for the economy, that everyone can survive and gets enough food and gets shelter and so on, and health services. So these things change, and therefore practical economics, normative economics, is to some degree dependent on it, although one may have temporal consensus about something that, for instance, welfare is the main aspect. But today, as you, well, we won't discuss that in detail. For instance, people are starting now strongly pushing so-called happiness research and say that the main goal for economics should be happiness and not welfare. And then you've got to say what you mean by happiness and for whom you say that, and so on. So you get into all these problems, you know, what is useful, what is the goal for a human life, and who is going to decide that, and so on. So all the political questions associated with that. Now, in classical and the early neoclassical view, individual well-being was understood hedonistically, in harmony with what I said before, that the idea of happiness and being happy as choosing such that your happiness is increased, that was of course also the central perspective for normative economics. So it was hedonistically understood, and that concerns then certain mental states such as pleasure and happiness. And the problem with them is, of course, if you look at from a scientific point of view, how can we measure that? How can we theorize about it, and how can we measure it? Very difficult to measure happiness. This is really hard. And the prevailing economic view, and that is characteristic for the second phase of neoclassical economics, where you try to abstract from all this psychological stuff and say, this is baggage, right? We don't need that in economics, and we can build a science of the economy that is independent of that. And the question is, how do you do the trick? And the trick is such that you say, well, we abstract from that stuff and look at rankings, preference rankings, and from preference rankings, we get both the things to investigate, and we get the answers we want to have in order to apply economics in the political arena. So the prevailing economic view is then that welfare is measured by the satisfaction of preferences. You say, if we understand what the preferences of someone, not understand, if we know the preferences of someone, then I know what these people prefer to choose, comparatively. So if they can satisfy their preferences in an optimal way, this is what is the best for them. This is what they want to have. Therefore, we got to articulate normative economics in terms of preferences. Right? So that seems to fit into this picture. You get rid of psychology, but don't get completely teethless, such that you can say, oh, this is all subjective. Oh, God, I don't know what to say. And these want that, and those want that. No idea. No, you just say, okay, we measure the preferences by choices, and then we have the preference structure. And from the preferences, we can say what political actions would satisfy preferences best. And this is then what is welfare increase. And that's the basis then of normative economics. So, for instance, now this is what I just said. I must have read that before. If agents have consistent preference orderings and are well-informed and self-interested, then preference is expressed what is good for the agent. Of course, these conditions here are not completely trivial, namely they are well-informed and self-interested, but if they are, and this is expressed in the preferences, then you can say we increase welfare by satisfying preferences. Preferences express what is good for the agent. And also a thing that is very, very, well, nice, it falls out of that sort of Ansatz, that the question of paternalism doesn't exist anymore. It's a question, and economists usually hate that. As you see in today's discussions about nudging, many economists think, well, that means I know it better than him, what's good for him or her, and that's not okay. I want to be, objective. That's not my business. This is philosophical stuff, and paternalism is something unscientific. We hate it. And that really disappears from here, and that disappears, of course, only if the agents are really well-informed and self-interested, because then that works. But then it works, and then you can say, I don't have to tell them what's good for them. They know that themselves because they are well-informed and self-interested. And then that works with these preferences as the basis for normative economics. But as I said, the question of paternalism doesn't even come up, and this is, of course, what economists loved, for very good reasons. As I said, it's for purely scientific reasons that you say, how shall I say to someone, I know better what's good for you? Isn't that ridiculous in a sense? And it's anti-democratic and so on. This is why many people are very unhappy about all this nudging stuff, in spite of the empirical data. But there is something, there is something fishy, this paternalistic, even if it's weak paternalism, but there is something, where you can say, I don't like it. Anyway, I'm not discussing that here in detail. I'm just telling you here's a problem. And that's, of course, many economists and philosophers of economics are completely aware of that. Now, there are objections, of course, to the identification of well-being with the satisfaction of preferences. This is all stuff from Hausman here, that preferences may be based on mistaken beliefs. So if you believe something, for instance, I have difficulties, this is a more or less topical and subjective example, I have difficulties that people from, say, economic very bad conditions, somewhere in the Midwest in the United States, who prefer to vote for Trump because they think that Trump is the one who will be better for their economic conditions and so on. They assume that they prefer Trump to a Democratic, or preferred at least to a Democratic candidate because they thought he will serve my preferences better. This billionaire from New York will serve better than a Democratic candidate. And the question is, are they well informed about that? Is that what's going to happen? Well, we'll see it in the next election, perhaps. Anyway, so if you have mistaken beliefs, then of course you may do things that are not really in your own interest. And then measuring your happiness or increased, not happiness, but your welfare in terms of preference is of course not a good measure. So it really depends on that your preferences are not based on mistaken beliefs. So this is one of the sources. Then there are sometimes higher values than just your own well-being. And many people, they have higher values than just well-being. They do things for others. I give you one example. It's a very little one, but a very nice one, which shows that behavioral economics is really interesting. This was a year ago or so. I was at a conference, not even a year ago, in Cologne in Germany, and there was another gentleman, 50, and we were at the tram, and we didn't know how to get tickets, right? And then there were two young students. There were two female students, we two older men and two younger female students. And I went to one of them and said, how do I get a ticket here? Blah, blah, tell me how it works. And then she said, yeah, in principle, this and that. And then she went away, and I tried to find my way. And then she came back and said, look, in which direction are you going? And I said, we go that direction. And then she said, oh, it's after 7 now, and in Cologne there is a rule, if you have a tram ticket, you can take someone with you on the same ticket, and then this person doesn't have to pay. So these two young ladies, they weren't interested in me or my partner there. They just asked us, to have a free ticket there. They didn't have anything from that, nothing. So from an economic point of view, they should have chatted together, and have more fun, instead of, going to these foreigners and then go there and ask them, hey, you can have a free ticket, it's for us, it's nothing. So that was a sort of, a very weak form, but it is still there. It's a sort of altruism that was they had no personal damn interest there, in us not paying to pay there. But this is how people are sometimes. So people are sometimes even honest. You ask them, where's the way to the train station? And you get an honest answer. Yeah, just like that. People could lie to you and then enjoy you, how you run away, somewhere. But sometimes people aren't. So self-interest is not everything. So we just don't function that way. And the question is whether that is something which is then, detrimental to the idea that we can do welfare economics on the basis of measured preferences together with these assumptions. And we will see that in behavioral economics, this is one of the central pillars of saying this is not a negligible effect, that people are not only self-interested, but there are really facts which are important economically, and we must not abstract from them in economics, because there are certain situations in which we make grave mistakes and don't understand how the economy is working if we abstract away from that. So there are sometimes other values. Higher values than own well-being. Okay, other values, higher. They may trump the own well-being values. Anyway, then. Of course, preferences may be result of prior or current manipulation, for instance, by policymakers. A possible example, I'm not claiming this is an example, a possible example that a politician manipulates you and tells you, he's going or she's going to do the best for you, and then you believe it, and then you're not really contributing to your own welfare. Now, what is interesting here is, and that's a much more general remark, is this, that this dispute about the adequate understanding of preferences, that reflects a fundamental tension that's often present in the social sciences. Not only in economics, you find the same in sociology, for instance, I guess also in political science and anthropology, cultural anthropology. Namely, you have on the one hand, you try to get an adequate understanding of the subject matter. For instance, what is human happiness? You say, I really must understand that, otherwise I don't understand how the economy works. On the other hand, you have the postulate of methodological feasibility. You must do that in a scientific way. So if you say something is important, that's wonderful, but you've got to be able to measure it somehow, right? So unless you can't, if you can't access it, even if it's important, it doesn't help you. You say, yes, but it's necessary to have it in order to have an adequate understanding of the subject matter. Wonderful, but if you can't do science with it, it doesn't help you, right? So this is something that's very often also in psychology, also all of 20th century psychology with behaviorism and psychoanalysis and all that. There's always a tension that some party says, in order to really understand the subject matter, you've got to go my way. And the others say, wonderful way, but scientifically not feasible. No reproducibility, not observability, and whatnot, no experiments, and so on. So this is a tension which is easier. It's in principle, it's the tension of in the other sciences as well, in humanities. But here in the social sciences, you have that problem. Say, intelligence. Okay, you have an idea what intelligence is. And then you say, oh, yeah, we got to measure it. And then you start with an intelligence test. And I mean, there are dozens around. And they are not completely in agreement. And the question is, then psychologists will say, yeah, but we got to measure it because we have to make decisions about human beings, and then it's better to make it on an intelligence test, even if I don't really know what this measures, right? So this is a question that's permanent there, because on the one hand, we have an understanding, some sort of everyday understanding or cultural understanding of a certain subject matter, and then we want to have a science investigating that, and then these two things don't fit together so nicely because our understanding cannot be made scientific, and what can be made scientific may be away from the understanding, and then you've got to find a compromise. And this is what happens. Of course, economics is no exception to sociology and other psychology and other sciences. It's a fundamental problem whether you hit the target you want to hit in a way that's scientifically feasible, all right? And then people make different decisions. In academia, make different decisions. Say, no, I go to the softer side because then I believe I really get to my subject, even if I can't run statistical tests. And others say, I don't care whether you're so close, but what I can do, I can run statistical tests, and I know what I'm doing, right? So this is a tension. That tension is present. Of course, it's especially present in normative economics, but it's also present in positive economics. So it's something, and it's good to be aware of that. And as I said, economics is not the sick discipline here, but it's all the other social sciences as well, and to some degree also the natural sciences. All right. Now, the next problem with that preference-based welfare discussion is the following. If individual welfare is measured by preference satisfaction, then interpersonal welfare comparison becomes problematic or impossible. So if you could measure happiness, right, and you can say, how happy does it make you on a scale from 1 to 100 if you buy that product, and then you say 55, and then I find someone else who said it makes me happy 65, then of course the 65 person gets the product. So and then you could say, you can interpersonally say, but we can't measure that, right? So we don't have that. And once you have the preference satisfaction as the measure for welfare satisfaction, then individual comparison seems to disappear. It seems at least problematic. All right. I haven't studied that closely enough. I would guess it's impossible, but I don't know if Hausman says it's problematic. Anyway, and therefore, one must, if one has to compare welfare or one has to compare welfare contributions, therefore the goal must be that a welfare evaluation of economic processes, institutions, etc. should be done without interpersonal comparison. And that looks, of course, pretty hard when you can say, well, if I don't know how much it means for someone to get this or not get this, and I can't compare that with other people, how could I ever compare different how could I evaluate different? How could I evaluate alternatives, with respect to welfare? And economists were very clever here and found something, namely Pareto efficiency, which is probably known to all of you. And I just say a few words about it. This is a way of somehow comparing things with respect to welfare. And I just mentioned it. It's not a philosophical thing. It's just economics, well, probably 201 or whatever. A state S is Pareto superior to R to the state R. If some people prefer S to R and nobody prefers R to S. So you ask people on the basis of their preferences, what would you rather have, R or S? And if some people say, I prefer R, then R is Pareto superior, and that can be pushed to a maximum or optimum, a maximum of efficiency. If there is no R that is Pareto superior to S, then S is Pareto optimal or Pareto efficient. And apparently that takes, of course, care of preferences of people. So when people say, yes, I prefer R to S, that means, well, in some sense, they are better off with R, right? At least they don't want to swap it with S. So you get some sort of measure, and what you don't have to do with that trick, with this Pareto trick or with Pareto measure, you get the idea that you can compare economic alternatives with respect to welfare of individuals. So that's the idea. The point is that Pareto optimality does not imply satisfaction of other values. So all the stuff about freedom, justice, and so on is abstracted from. This is the price of having only preferences, that many other values are just not taken into account, but it's useful for cost-benefit analysis. So it's not useless, but in a way, this is just the price you have to pay, right? You say, I want to abstract from something for methodological reasons, and that has consequences that other aspects are also not taken 100% care of. This is, but as I said, this is in all the social sciences. So you say, oh, I'm unhappy with the intelligence tests, and I don't know whether they measure what I want to measure, but the question is either you have nothing or you use it. And here in this case, you can say, well, at least we can speak about Pareto optimality, even if that is not everything we are interested in. But this is something you can measure, you can handle it, you can use it, and then scientists typically everywhere, by the way, are happier with stuff that they can handle, that can be controlled, that can be overlooked and justified, instead of having nothing, right? So this is what happens here in normative economics. All right. Any questions on normative economics here, or additions, suggestions? this does not seem to be the case. Okay. So we continue with positive economics. This will be, by the way, I won't say much more about normative economics in the course of this class, although there is a huge discussion about various things. This is all connected more with practical philosophy. My area of expertise is really, although I'm not an economist, but my area of expertise is much more philosophy of science, so the methodological questions. And so I will talk with much more confidence about these methodological things than about these normative things. So we come to positive economics, and to say it in one word, I mean, it's rather trivial, that it analyzes descriptively economic processes of all sorts by various means. So this is very open, all sorts and various means, theories, models, blah, blah, blah. But the point is a description as contrasted to an evaluation, right? Or as contrasted giving goals for economic activity of whatever sort, right? So it's a description of processes, institutions, of course, agents, and so on and so forth. The main classifications is, of course, this is, again, trivial. Microeconomics focus on individuals and firms, and the equilibrium idea is no excess demand and no excess supply. This is just typical assumptions that you find in the models. And then macroeconomics focus on relations among economic aggregates. This is trivial and consensual, but the point is, how about the possible unification with microeconomics? So what's the relation of macroeconomics to microeconomics? Macroeconomics was invented in the 1930s and then claimed to be, somehow autonomous. And there has been an ongoing discussion, as far as I can see, until today. And we'll come to this problem because it's really interesting, also from this comparative point of view that you saw. I will often use that I compare economics to other disciplines and then show you that the situation in economics may be unique or it's not unique, right? And you may get some understanding of what economics is by contrasting it with other disciplines, biology, physics, whatever is necessary, as Milton Friedman did, for instance, with physics a lot and with a fictitious biology. Anyway, then of course econometrics, so to speak, the methodological part with statistics and all of that, empirical estimation, elaboration and testing of models, and there are various schools within econometrics becoming very quickly very technical. There are people in philosophy of science who are interested in these technical things, very technical things. I am less so, don't know very much about it, so I won't treat it in this class, but treat to those topics where I know a little more about it. Other schools and branches will be treated in section 3. Yes. All right. And now I come to this question of the relation between positive and normative economics. And that seems to me an important thing that every economist should know, that you know where you are moving with your positive science and also with your normative economics. And therefore I spend some time on it. And here is more literature. There is lots of literature on it. There is Mark Blaug is also one of the pioneers in philosophy of economics. I think this is the first real book, I think, on methodology of economics. And he's a full chapter on that, the distinction between positive and normative economics. Milton Friedman has a section in his paper, the first section on the relationship. So there is much more literature. I give you first the mainstream here and then some criticism and some ideas. So the economic mainstream is this is very, I guess, plausible also. Positive economics concerns facts, normative economics concerns values and norms. And facts on the one hand and values and norms on the other are very different from each other. So it's one thing what you want, what you desire, what you think is good, and another thing is what is the case, right? So positive economics is about what is the case or will be the case if you do this and that, whereas normative economics tries to tell you on whatever grounds this should be done, or this is a good action, or this is a bad action for whatever reason. Right? So these things seem to be very far apart. And this has been a long discussion in philosophy also, the distinction between facts and norms. And it seems to be pretty clear. If one looks a little closer, it's becoming a little blurry, and we'll discuss that. Okay, so this is the mainstream. Is this, may I ask you, I mean, who thinks or who has heard something like that in normal economic classes wherever in the world? Is that the normal thing that the economics professors tell you? Distinction between facts and norms? Yeah, yeah. In political science, yeah, there also, I mean, they have the same problem, because there you have political philosophy, which develops, what is a good political system, versus political science describing the functioning of political systems. Absolutely. There you have the same. So you have the same also in sociology, if you wish. You have a normative social theory, what is a good society, versus description of social processes. They've got the same. You have the same in education. One is education. You articulate the norms for education. What should be the goals of education? Should it be that people get good jobs, or should it be personal fulfillment, humanistic values, and so on and so forth? And the other one is empirical research on educational processes, right? And you have that in all the social sciences in which you can articulate goals. You have that also in the psychotherapy. I mean, the question is, what is the goal of a psychotherapy? And then you have empirical research in psychotherapeutic processes in which you say, what happens with these and that and that and that interventions? What happens to the patient? So that's absolutely right. It's a standard distinction. It's a distinction that applies to economics. And okay, now you know it. All right, hopefully. All right. I think it's absolutely fundamental that economists know that. They really know that what's going on there. Anyway, so it seems to be, so it's still economic mainstream. The distinction between facts and norms value is reasonably clear. We can say whether something is then a fact or whether it's a norm. Therefore, positive economics is independent of normative economics, because finding out what is happening in economic processes, institutions, agents, and so on and so forth is independent of what you think should be done in the economy, right? What should be the political goals? Where should the economy be governed to or directed to, right? This is independent, so it appears at least. So positive economics is independent of normative economics, whereas positive economics is necessary for normative economics in the following sense, that it supplies means for given ends. So the political goals, for instance, you have the political goal and say, I want to have in Switzerland more economic equality. Right? The inequality is too strong, so you belong to a certain party, say the SVP, and then you say, well, there is too much economic inequality, and we want to have more economic equality. For those who are not come from Switzerland, this was a joke, because the SVP usually does not claim that. But anyway, so, and the question is then, if you say, okay, how can we realize now more economic equality? What shall we do, right? Shall we just take the money away from the rich people and give it to the poor? Or shall we increase taxes? Or shall we what tax? And what shall we do, right? Then the question is that you have different alternatives, and you ask yourself, so which of these alternatives will really produce the desired effect? And there you need knowledge, when you do something to the economy, what will be the consequences? This is about facts, right? You say, if I push here, what will happen there, right? And there you have to know it. You don't have only to have the wonderful, good, humanistic, fantastic goal, but you have to know what the system does that you are treating, right? And therefore, and this is the standard story, positive economics supplies means for given ends. Where the ends come from is a different story, right? Normative economics articulates them, perhaps on the basis of philosophical considerations of good life, or possibly because parties say we want this or that, and so on. So it seems to be that positive economics supplies means for given ends, and I come back to that in greater detail. So this is the economic mainstream, that this is the relation. And it seems to be that not everyone is completely familiar with that, right? But you should be. This is really important, I think. Well, I'm not an economist, so the economy professors should tell you what is really important. But looking from the outside as a citizen, I can say this is what economists should know. All right. Now, let's look at that a little more closely, about this relationship, and then also some criticism that these distinctions have faced. Now, positive economics, I mentioned it already, describes economic processes by articulating concrete descriptions, hypotheses, models, and theories regarding economic facts. This is a whole battery that an instrumentarium that descriptive economics has developed, like other fields as well, in biology or physics or chemistry or whatever. You develop all these sorts of things, descriptions, hypotheses, models, and so on and so forth. And often then it is said that a positive science is value-free, right? Because the idea is there, here are the facts, and you describe the facts, so values don't play any role whatsoever. And that's the idea then, that you say, if you want to give this mainstream picture, the difference is normative economics is full of values and positive economics is value-free. And here you see the contrast, right? And that is only partly right. That got to be articulated much more carefully, because otherwise you run deep into trouble. It's really misleading. It means what this value-free postulate that tries to say something useful and something correct, but it's very badly expressed, and it must be expressed much, much better. So what that means is, when you say that positive science is value-free or must be value-free, then you want to say that social values must not influence the empirical results of science. This is what you want when you say that positive science should be value-free. And I give you examples. So, for instance, you do equality, research on equality in a certain economy, then the social value of quality must not influence empirical results about, for instance, existing inequality and vice versa. So your ideals, what you think would be very nice to have in a society, should not influence your empirical investigation, right? That should be independent of it. And in that sense, your empirical investigation should be free of that value, in some sense. It's still a little more complicated. It should not influence your empirical results about the existing inequality. So that would be wishful thinking, right? If you think, I love my society, it's not that unequal, it's fine. And if you look then empirically, and it's not the case, this is just not good science. This is something else. Okay. Or for instance, this is very, very important in countries in which death penalty is being discussed. The belief in the value of some form of penalty must not influence the empirical investigation of its effectiveness. So there are apparently countless empirical investigations in the effectiveness of death penalty, and it seems to be zero. But people who defend death penalty seem to say, death penalty is what we need to build a better society, right? So the question is simply, it's an empirical question. Does penalty... Well, there are ethical aspects, moral aspects, of course. But on one level, there's just the question, if you claim that death penalty is effective in lowering a crime rate of a certain sort, then you can empirically possibly investigate that, and then there may be a positive or negative result. The main point is that this empirical, the belief in the usefulness, what is in some circles there, that they say we must have death penalty, United States and other countries, they're unimpressed by empirical data. And that is, of course, not okay. So empirical data should, of course, inform your judgment about effectiveness, but on the other hand, your ideas, what should be good because you love penalty for whatever reason, that should not influence the empirical results, of course. So the point is, social values must not influence the results of empirical investigations. In so far, empirical investigations must be social value free. In so far, but there are values involved in all positive science, including economics. It's not value free. There are values. And here is the first important, a very important one. It's the choice of your research project. If you are an economist or scientist or whatever, and then there are plenty of things you can investigate, but you think, I want to investigate this one. And that means, for some reason, you value it higher. There may be personal interests, values of many kinds, as well as methodological abilities and inabilities. If you look concretely, this is not your practice yet, but if you look at academia, then people have to choose what am I going to research, right? So, and then you may be interested in inequality, for instance, because you think equality is so important, and as an economist I want to contribute to it, and therefore I will do positive economics and investigate the sources of and forms of inequality. This is, of course, a value judgment deeply rooted in your personality, and it's completely legitimate, as long as you don't let these values influence your empirical results. Your empirical results must be independent of that. But the choice of the subject matter of your research is, of course, value influenced. And that's perfectly okay, and it's impossible without that, because somehow you have to choose, right? So this is perfectly okay. And certainly it's so that many of the research subjects that are researched today in all disciplines, they are given by policy, science policy. All the money that's distributed by the National Science Foundation, Schweizer Nationalfonds, everywhere, much of it has political goals, right? The Schwerpunktprogramme and what you have to know. They're all political goals because society or politicians say, we don't understand our health system, therefore we spend 30 million on the health system and ask the economists to investigate. And then, of course, there's a value that you say, yeah, we should know more about our health system. And then, of course, this is a value. And once you say, oh, that money comes wonderful because I've got two so intelligent pre-docs, doctoral students, and one postdoc, and they want to have a job. Oh, yes, we investigate that, right? And then you go there. So it's absolutely clear. So the choice of research subject is, of course, value-driven, no doubt. And also, but there are other kind of value come into play. The procedure of research is full of values, because you have to evaluate every step what you're doing, every method you choose, every result you produce. You have to evaluate it, whether it's good or bad. You don't do that on the basis of social values, whether you like the result or not, but you do that on the basis of what is called epistemic values. So you play around with a hypothesis or with a model, and then you look at about its predictive power, its accuracy, its explanatory power, its scope, its consistency, etc., etc., etc. And you need for the process of research values all the time, because you get something and then you got to decide, do I continue or do I something else? And that means evaluation. Do I repeat the experiment, yes or no? You evaluate the result. So you evaluate constantly. So it's absolutely misleading to say science is value-free. Nonsense, something else is meant, because it's full of values. No, continuously values are there. They are necessary in order to evaluate descriptions, hypotheses, models, theories, and their concrete applications. And you do that at every step. You know, you calculate something, and then you say, is that a plausible result? Then you use the value of plausibility with some background assumptions, say, no, that is wrong, so I got to start from new, and so on and so on and so forth. So there are values all the time, are there values in place. So to say that science is value-free is literally speaking just nonsense. It's just completely false. It's full of values, but epistemic values, right? And in the choice of the subject, also other sorts of values, which is legitimate. What is meant is, don't let social values or religious or whatever influence the results of what you're doing. That would be wishful thinking. That's absolutely illegitimate. Their scientific results in positive science should be independent. All right. So that's the point about the value, neutrality or of positive economics. It's just a slogan that's very misleading. Okay. Now, normative economics articulates goals, norms, and values for the economy. So, for instance, articulating meaning, making them more concrete. To say, for instance, I want an economy with less inequality than the economy we have. That is not a very precise statement, because there are many aspects to economic inequality. Do you speak about income? Do you speak about taxes? Do you speak about wealth? Do you speak about economic opportunities? What are you talking about when you speak about economic inequality? Just read the latest literature by what's the guy from France on economic inequality? Piketty, yes. Just read the book on economic inequality. I just read it. It's very interesting because it shows you whether you like his political stance or not. It's unimportant. But that analytical part is very good, I think, because it just explains to you, if you like economic equality, fine, but please tell me what you mean. Right? And this is important. This is the job, as I see it then, of normative economics, of, on the basis, of course, knowledge of positive economics, of explicating and articulating what do you mean by these things. And this is what economists have to do, because if a politician, say, from the left says, oh, you know, the inequality in Switzerland is horrible and we're going to do something against it, wonderful idea, but you've got to say what you want, right? And this is then where economists are really asked. So the norms and so on about increase of welfare, increase of income equality, free markets, monetary stability, and so on and so forth, these are all things that have to be articulated. And this is really the job of economists, because this is where you have to know something about that system which you want to change or want to keep stable. So to argue for such goals typically presupposes higher norms and values, and this may turn out to be difficult, to say the least. Well, usually you have some political background or religious background or whatever you have in the background, or human rights or whatever. You have some sort of normative background. And the problem is these norms and values are often seen as subjective or political as opposed to scientific. So people just say, oh yes, these are political goals. And there's some truth to that, because if you ask, I mean, is there a scientific justification for these norms or those norms? Very difficult to say. I mean, equality is some sort of value. And some people take it very seriously, other people think it's not that important. The problem, as I introduced it in the last session, was how does this normative economics, whatever it is then in detail, how does it relate to positive economics? And I give you now the relationship between normative and positive economics, how it is idealized in an idealized representation. Many economists, I guess, will agree with that, but then we will also encounter criticism by Daniel Hausman on this rather sharp distinction or sharp contrast between the two, and then we'll discuss that in detail. So, normative economics articulates some politically desired goal G. Wherever that goal comes from, that the point is that the concrete articulation is then something typically economists have to do. So I gave you the example, if from the political side, some party or whatever, or the government, say we want to have more economic equality, then it's up to the economists to spell that out, what that means, and make different offers also, what that may mean, what you mean by economic equality. So this is part then of normative economics. So normative economics, therefore, articulates some politically desired goal. And then they go to the positive economists and they say, and positive economics then supplies causal regularities connecting different means MI and the goal G. So in order to realize the goal, you've got to apply some sort of means, some actions, some decisions, and that positive economists then say, look, we know about certain causal connections between certain means and the goal G, and whenever means MI is realized, then goal G is causally produced plus certain side effects, right? So you want to have more economic equality, and then you say, okay, we tax big incomes 80%, right? And then they won't increase their wealth, and therefore we produce more economic equality. This is causally so. If you take away money from those people who are very rich, then of course you produce more equality. Well, there are certain side effects, and they are very important in economics. Now, policymakers in the ideal case then pick one of these MIs, these means that generate G, with a view towards their unintended side effects in order to realize G with as little damage as possible. That's, of course, you do something. I mean, this is like in medicine. You give a certain medication, it has side effects, and then, of course, you optimize both the therapeutic value of the medicine and you try to avoid side effects. So it doesn't help you if you heal the patient and that the disease is going away, but after a fortnight, the person is dead, right? So this is a side effect you don't want to have. Now, for economics, it's very, very, very important, and you're all familiar with that, I guess. Economic side effects may be counterproductive to G. So you try to realize something, and the side effects destroy everything. So this is what sometimes, or many times, people who do not know much about economics completely underestimate. So, for instance, you say, okay, we want to tax these very rich people. You know, we increase taxes, income taxes, whatever taxes for them. because we need more money for the government, so you tremendously increase that. The side effect may be that these people leave the country, right? And you are left then with a higher tax rate, but much, much, much fewer people who pay the tax rate. In the end, you may get less taxes, and the goal was to increase taxes. The effect is decrease of taxes because of the side effects. The side effect being that people may migrate away. So this is one of these side effects that economists discuss. Or for instance, when you have a minimum wage, so some socialist party or social democratic party asks for minimum wage, and they think, well, we improve the situation for the poor. And then some economists may say, look, the side effect of having a minimal wage may be massive unemployment, because the companies don't want to pay that, and then they say, okay, we do something else, and we don't hire these people. And then the side effect really destroys what the goal of the whole thing was. So this is typical for economics and typical for missing understanding by the public when the economists then say, don't do that for this or that reason, and very often it's then interpreted as someone not liking that goal, and that doesn't have to be the case. It may be just that knowing the side effect or having an estimation of the side effect leads you to the fear that the side effects will destroy what you intended. So that's very important, and therefore we need the positive economists if we want to realize certain goals, because the positive economists can possibly tell you about the side effects, from experience, and they have then positive knowledge about possible side effects, and therefore they are important here for politicians in order to realize certain goals in an efficient way. So that's the idealized story.
Now, this mainstream view of the independence of positive economics from any sort of social values, that has been challenged, and it has been seen as a very idealized picture. But this issue is highly controversial because it is, as you will see shortly, partly also a political issue. Now, roughly the main criticism is that positive economics is not completely value-free, and it covertly contains social values, contrary to what the mainstream economists claim. And these social values are not just innocent, but they may favor certain groups. And therefore, positive economics is not value-free and impartial. And then economic science, which supposedly just describes an economic reality, is in fact not impartial and just objective, but favoring certain groups. Different critics identify different groups as being illegitimately favored by positive economics, and we'll see that in a moment when we see where these presumed social values enter positive economics. So I give you just one example, and then I give you more literature where you can find more of that. Economic indexes are supposed to implicitly contain social values. So an index is not just a representation of reality, but it covertly contains social values. That's the claim. And if you look, for instance, at the consumer price index, then you all know that a consumer price index is based on some basket of goods. And the basket may, for instance, not represent low budget consumers, such that price changes of some goods changing the index may not be felt by such groups. So the economic situation of these low income groups in these cases, for instance, may then not be represented in the pertinent basket. Or another example, the GDP. Many goods and services don't enter the index. So for instance, household produced services, so changes there in the household produced services do not change the GDP index, and therefore again these groups who perform household services are not represented in the index. Or final example, the unemployment rate. It strongly depends, of course, on who is classified as unemployed, And there are many ways how you can define those who are unemployed, are looking for jobs, and that, of course, then influences the index. You find more of these arguments in a recent paper by Julian Rice, Fact, Value, Entanglement in Positive Economics. As I said, the whole issue is extremely contentious because it is politically loaded, and people who then say claim to favor some groups, then they claim that positive economics doesn't do justice to that.
Macroeconomics is full of controversies. This is various reasons. Well, it is, you see that also in other disciplines. If you go to an aggregated level, be it biology or be it physics or whatever, you have certain problems that you do not have when you go to the respective micro level, where you have certain entities, well-defined entities, with certain interactions. But once you go to the macro level, things become sometimes difficult, blurry, and it is. And so macroeconomics is full of controversies, and they are partly due to its importance for politics. So because politicians are, of course, interested in macroeconomic stuff. I mean, they want to, have more, economic equality or inequality or whatever, or they want to have a better unemployment rate, or they want to have less inflation or more inflation. So these are all aggregated entities in which they're interested, and therefore the relations that I mentioned between the means and the goal, the means are macro, the connection is macroeconomic, and therefore, of course, the setting of goals and what may come with them psychologically may, of course, influence macroeconomics, and therefore there may be an influence there, and that may be part of the controversies within macroeconomics. And then one of the possibilities of trying to confront these controversies is saying, wait a minute, on the macro level itself, it may be difficult, to find the good arguments. But what about anchoring macroeconomics in microeconomics? Because it's individual agents and firms and so on at the micro level who produce by aggregation then the macro effects. So we may get something important and solid by looking down at the micro level and somehow anchoring or reducing, or whatever the favorite term is, reducing the macro level to the micro level. Much the same way you have a car and suddenly the car doesn't start, then you do not say, oh, the wholeness of the car is somehow not okay, right? The wholeness has been violated or whatever. No, you're saying it's one of the parts, right? You get to the micro level. The micro level is the parts of the car. And you say, why does the whole thing not move, right? The whole car with everything that's in it and on it and me in it and so on. You don't say, oh, the macro level, oh, the wholeness is somehow destroyed. Oh, what's happening? No, you're saying it's one of the part is not functioning, right? And then you look which part it is, and you start, there are two main branches then. One is electricity, and the other one, if it's an auto engine, and the other one is fuel, and then blah, 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 and then you go down until you find the part, right? So you try to fix it at the level of parts. So this is the same there, that you can ask, if you have macroeconomic effects that you dislike, you say, what do I have to do on the micro level, right? Changing incentives or whatever it is, or imposing taxes or whatever you can do. Okay, so the relationship between macro and micro is therefore important. And here are some of these questions. Should macroeconomics be reduced to microeconomics? And if you tend to say yes, then in which sense? What does that mean exactly? We'll see that this is not clear what it means. Or is macroeconomics autonomous, as some macroeconomists claim? And again, the question is, what do you exactly mean by being autonomous? What does it mean, right, to say that macroeconomics is autonomous? Or is the distinction between macroeconomics and microeconomics artificial anyway and should be given up? I mean, this is comparatively new. It's from the 1930s. It may have been appropriate at that time, but it may be the case that today we want to say, no, forget it. The distinction between macro and micro is artificial. It's been established, of course. We have professors for this and that, but perhaps it should be given up. Now, I shall deal with these questions in section 4 of this course. This is a very specific question in the philosophy of economics, but as I told you already, very, very similar questions turn up in many, many other disciplines, from the natural sciences to the social sciences as well. So you've got that within physics, right? If you study solid-state physics and you try to connect it then with the theory of atoms or quantum mechanics or whatever, you have it in chemistry, you have it in biology, you have it in sociology, you've got it in political science, you've got it very, very often in many different disciplines. So it is worthwhile if one tries to understand that also in different disciplines, we may get some input for economics, and this is what I'm going to do in section 4 of this course.